The Unitarian Universalist Church that I grew up in, which had its own interesting architecture, maybe not quite as interesting as our architecture here, but had its own interesting architecture. It had this window right next to the pulpit that extended from floor to ceiling, and the ceiling was this really high cathedral type ceiling. And right outside, there was just this gorgeous pine tree. And oftentimes I would sit there and absorb the readings that were being done and absorb the service and just look out and appreciate this fragment of nature. And it became this kind of focal point for me in the service. It became this way in which I felt connected to not just the people who were in that room, but also to a wider circle of life that was beyond that room. And oftentimes, we would read the parts of the hymnal that are in the back, and we would have responsive readings. And on more than one occasion, I can remember hearing that responsive reading, The Wild Geese. There's some others from Mary Oliver in the back of the book. And it struck me as this invitation to settle into a space of receptivity and connection. I think that a lot of her poetry is very much like a kind of prayer. And what I mean by that is that it is this way of focusing inward with this intention that opens us up to a different kind of experience and reminds us to receive life and think about life and feel our way into life in a way that we may have failed to notice before then. I think of prayer as a practice that it shouldn't be done just once. If it's done just once, it passes through and you forget about it. The invitation in prayer is to come back again and again and again, reminding ourselves of some kind of importance that we may miss in our daily lives. And I think that the poetry of Mary Oliver can function in some deep and beautiful ways to do exactly that. When in The Wild Geese, it reminds us that we don't have to be good. We don't have to walk on our knees for 100 miles repenting. We just have to let the soft animal of our body love what it loves. There is an invitation in that to release the jaggedness, the difficulty, the pain, the self-judgment that may be plaguing us, and to just arrive in the moment, in a moment of acceptance and in a moment of release from the difficulties that we may have been facing. She even has this wonderful poem about prayer that Pat read today. And in that poem, she says praying, it doesn't have to be the blue iris. It can be weeds in a vacant lot. And I think that speaks to an element in her poetry where she really wants to strip away the sense that in order to experience beauty, in order to experience meaning, in order to experience purpose, there has to be some kind of ornate structure that's built around it, Maybe that ornate structure is religion and religious tradition and like all of the weight of that, and you need to have done all of these things before you can kind of arrive and have some kind of spiritual experience. Or maybe it's this sense of like, well, if I'm gonna try to arrive in that moment of receptivity, then like the moment that I'm experiencing it has to be perfect. Like I have to find this like perfect moment in order to experience it. And so much of her poetry is saying, no, you don't have to do that. Instead, you can open into that space of receptivity and openness, release, and acceptance in pretty much any part of your life, in any moment in your life. And you'll find some invitation to beauty there. You might look at something like the weeds in a vacant lot, the weeds that we often dismiss as pesty, as something that needs to be pulled up, and you might discover that there's actually some real beauty and brilliance in that we may have overlooked. One of the reasons I think that Mary Oliver's poetry is particularly provocative and evocative for Unitarian Universalists, I'm going to use a fancy term here, but I think it's anti-transcendence. I think it's anti-transcendence. And what I mean by that is that her poetry calls us again and again to attend to life. Look to life. Look to this moment. Look to what you are experiencing here. Look to the beauty that you can see right outside that window here, or the beauty that you can see right here in this space. That's actually a move that pushes against some of the bigger tendencies that have happened in Western religion. So back when Christianity was being formed, and I'm going to get a little bit philosophical here, but stick with me. Back when Christianity was being formed, it was infused with what was called Platonism, which is the ideas of Plato. And Plato had this sense of there's this kind of realm of eternal ideas, and that's what's real. And the realm of the physical world, what we experience in our day-to-day lives, the world that comes into being and then passes away and decays, that's a shadow. That's not real. And if you're trying to find meaning by looking to that, you are doing something that is misguided, because that world of passing shadow it's just a shadow. It's really nothing. It's immaterial. What's real are these sort of eternal ideas that exist outside of the world. And that got infused into Christianity and a lot of Western religion. And so people turned to find religious meaning by looking towards ideas that were eternal, or a God that was eternal and apart from the world of change and fluctuation and the world of sort of the physical senses. Mary Oliver's poetry and the spirituality that she lifts up in her poetry deeply resists that. It is a way of turning towards the sacred by turning towards precisely what is impermanent, changeable, what comes into being and then passes away and decays. And for her, there is such a brilliance, such an exquisite beauty that can be beheld in that it allows us to sink into the way that meaning can show up in the vicissitudes of life, rather than thinking that all of this, everything that we experience, is just a sort of shadow or a temporary thing, and what's real is some kind of afterlife or idea of God, or some kind of realm of the eternal that's apart from it. So she's turning us again and again to to the physical world. Now, she's sometimes critiqued for being too almost sentimental about nature. And there's some kind of, sometimes people say like, oh, like Mary Oliver, it's kind of like, go spend some time smelling the roses, go outside and wander through a field and find some beauty. And there's a way in which that people think that some of her poetry lacks depth because of that, because it's not quite as dark as some other poets. There's a lot of poetry and a lot of poets, ones that I really love, who primarily write elegies, primarily write these poems about grief and loss and difficulty. And Mary Oliver's poetry doesn't tend to do that. It tends to be on a brighter side, and it tends to be something that is observant of beauty in the natural world and really trying to savor that. But there is an element, nonetheless, in which she acknowledges and lives the more complicated experiences of life. The poem that Gail read, The Uses of Sorrow, which is this dream that she had where this poem came to her, which is that someone she loved once gave her a box of darkness, and it took her years to realize that that too was a gift. We can unpack that in all kinds of ways. We can think about the ways that that is true in our own lives. I know I have had experiences with people where at first and for years, it felt like what had happened was just a profound misfortune and difficulty for me. And it was only years later that I was able to realize that it helped me grow and change in ways that turned me into the person I am today. And I now wouldn't give that up. I think that there's a real sort of complexity and depth in that. And then the last thing that I'll mention is the poem that Gloria read. And I feel like that poem, which I almost left out today, but then decided, no, let's do it. If there is any sense that, like Mary Oliver turns away from the hard topics, that poem is the response to that, which is all about how she wants to arrive at the death moment. And she wants to arrive at the death moment. She wants to arrive at the moment of her death as the bride, as having been the bridegroom to amazement, as having experienced the exquisite beauty of the world in such a way that amazement threaded her days. And to have that be such a powerful and commanding experience for her that she is then able to arrive at that last moment, not with fear, but with curiosity about what that next step will be. She says, when I step into that cottage of darkness, I want to be full of curiosity for what it will be. There's a lot of religious traditions that talk about how we need to approach that last moment and talk about what we need to do in terms of our fear and anxiety about our own mortality. There's a deep acceptance in her poetry, and in that poem in particular, that yes, this is going to happen. I know this is going to happen. And rather than pushing it away or fearing it, I want to be curious and open about it. And by having that as an orienting principle for how she wants to approach her own mortality and eventual death, she can then live life as the bridegroom of amazement. There's so much wisdom and goodness in what she has to share with us. And so I invite you to savor her poetry. I invite you to savor lots of different poets and learn from them and, hold what they have to offer. But I'm glad that Mary Oliver is catnip for Unitarians. I'm glad that we get to continue to lift her and to have her as something of a patron saint. I'll end it there.